Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're here again with author Stuart Sanders, who's got a new book out, which we're going to talk about: The Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again.
Well, it's been a reoccurring thing, which I greatly enjoy, of you pushing out a new book coming on the podcast. So
Well, I'm happy to be here.
I'll ask at the end, when's the new book coming out, but we'll talk about this one first.
Right.
But just in case anybody's unfamiliar with you, give us a quick, Kentucky connection and so forth.
Yeah, sure. I'm the former executive director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. I worked that job for about 10 years. Currently work at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I'm the author of 5 books, 2 about Perryville, one about the Battle of Mill Springs, one about an 1856 murder on a steamboat, and then the newest one, which is about a duel that was fought during the Civil War between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian up near Maysville in 1862.
Yeah, some good books. Now, if you go back and listen to some podcasts about the steam boat one, we did get a little down on a little bit of those parts, but it was all historically accurate.
That's right. Yeah, a little grim history with murder and vigilante justice, and a lot on steamboat explosions too. So happy stuff.
Yeah, this is about a duel, so we might be
more
headed
happy
down the same
stuff.
path.
That's right.
So I guess Civil War. A lot of Civil War books in this area. This one's connected to the Civil War as well. But look, what got you to this book? What sparked your interest?
Yeah, I think I've always had an interest in dueling. Really, I think it's just sort of it's kind of part of our culture. You look at the musical Hamilton, and that obviously is a central part of that musical too. I think I remember Bugs Bunny cartoons as a kid that even sort of kind of poke fun at dueling a little bit too. But I came across this story. I think I was looking at Winston Coleman's book, Famous Kentucky Duels, and it's a sort of good overview of several dozen duels that were fought in Kentucky. And this one really struck my interest because, again, it was fought during the Civil War. And I started thinking to myself, how did these two guys end up fighting this duel during the nation's largest conflict when, literally thousands upon thousands of men are killing one another on the battlefield? What sort of drove them to the dueling ground? So it was the first thing that, kind of made me interested. And then finding out that it was between, again, a Union colonel and this pro-secessionist Confederate civilian just really piqued my interest at that point.
Yeah, so it definitely kind of even got to that point where it fits the narrative of North versus South, even in this duel.
Right. Yeah, and they kind of, it's almost like turning the dueling ground into their own personal battlefield in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, and these both these people, were they soldiers?
So one was the Union colonel was named Leonidas Metcalf, and he was the son of Kentucky Governor Thomas Metcalf, and who's known as Old Stonehammer because he was a stonemason and was kind of a tough guy in his own right. Like Governor Metcalf had actually been involved in a few affairs of honor, and his son again was an early Unionist Kentuckian. Sort of joined the Union Army pretty early. He was a Mexican War veteran, but had a lot of illness in Mexico, so didn't really see a lot of active combat. But once the nation started falling apart during the Secession crisis, he enlisted pretty early on. His antagonist in this duel was a guy named William T. Casto, Casto, and Casto was a lawyer from Maysville who had no military experience whatsoever. And again, but he was again a pro-Confederate at the time, and the circumstances of the war and a few other things kind of drove them to the dueling ground.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to see a picture of Governor Metcalf and why he's called Stonehammer, go check it out. Go look it up. You'll understand, or not Stonehammer. Yeah, Stonehammer, right?
Yeah, he was Stonehammer.
Yeah.
And he was a really active stonemason too, and ended up there's the old governor's mansion in downtown Frankfort, and he ended up sort of, I think, doing a lot of the stone work on the foundation of that building.
What I was about to say, he had a connection to that as well.
And the greatest haircut of any governor, I think. His governor's portrait's pretty good. Sort of this wild-looking shock of white hair, and his very stern visage. So you can see how his son would have ended up fighting a duel at some point.
Yeah, yeah. Now, so both of these fellas, and I know Metcalf would have been from Kentucky and so forth.
Right.
The other guy as well.
Yeah, he was from Maysville and had actually been mayor of Maysville for a short time. Was kind of seen as a ne'er-do-well attorney, who he had sort of a family trust that he probably lived off of. So he didn't work a lot. Went down to New Orleans for a while to try his hand down there, and it just, I don't think his career really took off. So he ended up returning to Maysville. So by the beginning of the Civil War, he was sort of seen as a local secessionist, and that's kind of what started the duel. And the roots are really in the secession crisis, and that's why sort of the subtitle of the book is again, the main title is Anatomy of a Duel, and the subtitle is Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. And because during the secession crisis, when the Union was trying to sort of consolidate their power across Kentucky, one thing that they did was they arrested a fair number of civilians. And as part of this, Casto got swept up in a lot of that. And basically, in late 1862, a Union general named William Nelson, who was known as William Bull Nelson, had been in command of Camp Dick Robinson in Garrett County. He'd then been transferred up to the Maysville area, which was his hometown, and he established a camp there. And he was charged with sort of removing Confederate forces from eastern Kentucky in the Big Sandy Valley. And he realized before he embarked on that campaign that he needed to sort of clear the Maysville area, sort of the rear of his lines. He needed to clear that area out of any secessionists, in case they might try to attack the rear of his lines.
Mm-hmm.
So he ended up ordering Colonel Metcalf to arrest a number of men in Maysville, and that included William T. Casto. And so the duel really had its roots in that arrest. Casto was sent to a number of Union prison camps, also Fort Lafayette, in New York Harbor. And there he ended up sort of stewing about this arrest and was furious about it as an attorney. He felt like his constitutional rights had been violated. And even though all of the Maysville men ended up taking oaths of allegiance and sort of swearing their fealty to the Union cause and saying, look, I'm not going to cause any trouble, they were released. Casto refused to do that. He said, I'm not guilty. I'm not taking this oath. And he just grew more and more angry until finally the Secretary of State's office, William Seward, was sort of in charge of a lot of these civilian arrests. They basically just threw him out of the prison eventually. And he went back to Maysville and then immediately began practicing with pistols and rifles and preparing for an ultimate showdown. I mean, Southern honor culture was a big thing in Kentucky among upper class Kentuckians. And, Casto felt like his honor had been impugned, that he'd been insulted by this arrest. So as soon as he had a chance to strike at a prominent Unionist, he ended up choosing the man who had arrested him, Colonel Metcalf, and challenged him to a duel. And so the book looks at a lot of these civilian arrests that were going on in Kentucky at the time too. And a couple of real quick examples is, 3 state legislators were actually arrested by Union Home Guard members in Harrodsburg. Henry Clay's son, James B. Clay, was arrested. And even a former governor, Charles S. Moorhead, was also arrested. And Moorhead refused to take the Union loyalty oath because he had a huge plantation down in Mississippi. And he knew if he took a Union loyalty oath, the Confederates would confiscate all that property and also the, several hundred slaves that he had down there. So he ended up fleeing to Canada eventually. So I go into a lot of that in the book too.
Yeah, and didn't was it Bramlett, the governor, that resigned, or
well, it's Brian McGoffin was the
McGoffin?
First. Yeah.
Okay.
And during the secession crisis, and and he ended up leaving. Then James Robinson became governor after him. But McGoffin was, and a lot of was probably pro-Confederate. I mean, I think it's safe to say he was. I mean, he and others were sort of really angered by these Union policies of doing all these arrests, because you had newspaper editors and local politicians who were locked up for being potential secessionists. And the Lincoln administration also sort of ignored writs of habeas corpus and sort of legal proceedings, and then just would ship these guys out of state into prison. It was almost like, we think of modern shock probation, where, they'll throw you in jail sort of to try to scare you straight, kind of. And this is one thing that they were doing. I mean, Unionists realized, they're like, if we can sort of scare these people into thinking they're to sit in these dank, dark prison cells for the rest of their lives, perhaps they won't be so much trouble. And so they would kind of scare them, make them do these oaths of allegiance, and then would let them out. And again, some people ended up fleeing to Canada. Others, as I outlined in the book, did end up sort of violating those oaths and joining the Confederacy. So some men did sort of get out of jail, and then one guy joined John Hunt Morgan's command, for example, and almost like taking revenge on the guys who
Yeah.
arrested them.
Yeah. Now the dueling, dueling, of course, had been a big thing. Now, real quick side question:
Yeah.
Did Henry Clay ever do a
Oh
duel?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Henry
that's what I
Clay
was
fought a
thinking. He
couple of
was.
times. Yeah.
Yeah.
He fought one. Gosh, I think it was 1809 when he was a
Hmm.
state legislator. He fought against Humphrey Marshall, who's another legislator, and they'd been arguing over. Clay had said that there were tensions with Great Britain, and Clay said we should only wear clothes of American manufacture, and Marshall, I think it was this duel. He called him. He said that was the claptrap of a demagogue, and Clay got insulted and challenged Marshall to a duel, and then he dueled again later. And it,
Uh,
there are a lot of complaints about this great politician dueling, but it never really affected his political career. And
yeah.
Kentucky was so crazy during the 19th century. I mean, he probably earned votes because of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was dueling was seen as sort of an upper class thing to do, and defending your honor was very important. I mean, there's a sense honor is kind of like, what's the reputation that you have, but also, what do you think of yourself and your own reputation, but also what does society think about you? And if you were deemed to be a coward, for example, I mean, your business interests could dry up. One writer talked about your family turning away from you and your friends and family shunning you, basically, if you were deemed to be a coward. So it was taken very seriously, and duels were fought over everything from failed business deals to insults to someone stealing your girlfriend. I mean, it really ran the gamut. But Clay dueled with pistols several times. But what pistols weren't always used too, which I found to be pretty fascinating. The weapons that were chosen were pretty wild as well. Like Abraham Lincoln, for example, nearly had a duel with the Illinois state auditor. And the way it worked was, Jameson, if you insulted me and I challenged you to a duel, as the challenge party, you would get to pick the place of the duel and also the weapons that were used. And so the challenged man had sort of the advantage in that regard. And Lincoln, being a lot bigger than the Illinois state auditor, ended up picking broadswords. And he later said, here's this guy, used to swinging an axe on the, Illinois and Indiana frontier. He said, I knew that I would have cut the man in two, basically. And so the auditor wisely called off the duel. But, pistols at 10 paces, which would have been about 30 feet, was the typical weapon. And, according to some writers about dueling during the 19th century, said it was the only weapon you should choose. Flintlock dueling pistols that were smooth bore, so they weren't as accurate. Because it was meant to be just sort of a gentlemanly show, not always about drawing blood. But in the Casto Metcalf duel that I write about in this book, they actually used a weapon that was a rifle at 60 yards. It was a Colt revolving rifle, and they fought at 60 yards with it.
So, 60 yards. I mean, that seems like a good little distance. I mean, aren't the typical duels are more like 10 yards or something like that? I
Yeah,
mean,
with pistols, but again with rifles, they separated it quite a bit. But I mean, yeah, there were some duels that were fought. One in Lexington between two students who were at Transylvania University in I think it was the 1850s. They used shotguns at a really scary distance, loaded with slugs, and one student ended up literally blew the head off of the other one and killed him instantly. And
oh gosh.
and so the idea was, it wasn't always about drawing blood. There was the danger there, but duels were meant to be dispassionate and also fair. And so the
Mhm.
idea was to sort of, as a gentleman, you're supposed to be high toned and without passion, without anger. And so dueling was supposed to be a structured way to kind of remove that passion from a confrontation. And so that's why
Mhm.
there were so many rules, and you had seconds there who would sort of ensure that the rules were happening fairly. And so, if you may shoot at one another and miss the first fire, and the seconds would say, okay, his honor been satisfied. And a lot of times they say, yeah, we're done. We don't want to do this again. I forgive you, or I apologize for insulting you. And they'd go on their way. But if, there was a lot of animosity, they would actually shoot again and again and again until somebody was actually hit. And again, because dueling was meant to be fair, you weren't supposed to duel kind of a wounded person. So if one of the participants was hurt, you would immediately stop the duel. But again, as I mentioned, there were a lot of instances where men were actually killed on the dueling ground, and that's what happened in this story between Casto and Metcalf. One of the men actually got killed.
Yeah. Well, That sounds really crazy though, when you kind of think. I don't see how anybody would go past one shot and like, okay, you just
Yeah,
shot a gun at me and I'm
right.
alive. I don't really
Yeah,
want to risk this again.
I know. And there's a really funny line. After two duelists one time exchanged shots, one of the seconds said, "Well, look, um, what if they shake hands?" And the other second said, "Well, their hands have both been shaking this last half hour." They were just so terrified. And also, Cassius Marcellus
Oh
Clay,
yeah.
who's the
Oh,
Madison County emancipationist, who was known for kind of fighting a lot of fights with Bowie knives.
mhm.
It was said that he could sort of sever a silver chain with a pistol at a pretty far distance. However, after one duel, he said, he kept missing, and they sort of ended the duel because no one would hit each other. And somebody said, "Well, Cassius, you can sever a silver chain. Why couldn't you hit this guy?" He said, "Well, that's because the silver chain never had a damn pistol in its hand." So he recognized like staring at, down the barrel of another man's gun would certainly hinder your accuracy out of just fear. And that happened quite a bit too. And
Yeah.
but again, I mean, there were more, you sort of laugh about it now, but there were like
Mhm.
it was really deadly. I mean,
Yeah.
dozens of people were maimed, if not killed, and um, dueling was also illegal, and that's something to be very
Well,
clear about.
well, that's what I was. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, it kind of early 1800s, or
yeah. It
was it?
was sort of declared early or illegal very early on, and the 1850 Constitution even added that provision that to be a politician or an attorney or to have sort of a governmental office, you have to swear that you never participated in a duel or acted as a second. And that duel or that oath is still in existence. So if you're an attorney sworn in, or if you're joining a board like of a local library, even you have to affirm that you've never dueled or participated, which I love. I'm glad they've kept that in there.
Yes.
And people usually chuckle about it. But the reason is because at the time, these sort of honor-bound Kentuckians were so determined to protect their reputations that they would duel even though it was illegal. And the legislature was trying to prevent dueling by hoping that, like, the political ambition of a lot of these Kentuckians would ultimately outweigh their desire to duel. But again, as Henry Clay and many others have represented, that didn't make any difference. I mean, they
Yeah.
still ended up dueling.
Yeah. And didn't some would go to just different locations
Oh yeah,
where
yeah,
it was legal, and
right.
or different areas, whatever it may
Yeah,
be.
and it was mainly not where it was legal. It was more to sort of try to confuse local authorities as to who had jurisdiction over it. So, what is now the Kentucky Horse Park, there was a farm. It's called the James K. Duke Farm, and it's located. It's right on the Fayette County Scott County line. And so they basically fight on that property line, so you wouldn't know. Okay, is it the hey, we're in Scott County. Are we supposed to prosecute, or is it Fayette? And so a lot of times, the duels would go unpunished, as they most often did, because again, authorities were sort of even they would sort of give lip service a lot of times to, we don't like
Mhm.
dueling, but they still rarely did they prosecute duelists. And that duel I mentioned with the Transylvania University students, that was fought on what's now the Horse Park property too. And there were 5 or 6 duels that happened there, and several that were men were killed and wounded. So it was more of a jurisdiction issue at that time. But again, it was, I mean, having men like Henry Clay duel, and former
Yeah, what are you gonna
governors, and
do?
yeah, President Andrew Jackson, dueled in
Yeah.
Southern Kentucky even. And, it's sort of like, it's putting the societal stamp of approval on it. It's like, hey, it kind of, authorities gave a wink and a nod to it. Because again, honor was sort of paramount. I talk about, I think it was at the Filson Historical Society, I found this like dueling pledge that all these guys signed. And several of the people who signed this pledge, I will never duel, ended up fighting duels. And one guy actually wrote a little caveat on it. He signed his name and he wrote P.S. I will only duel under extreme circumstances, sort of thing. So it's like, there are a few fair weather signatories on that pledge, which is pretty wild to see. One was James Trotter, who fought a duel in Lexington at one point too. But
Mhm.
the causes of duels were sort of crazy. I mean, in Bardstown, John Rowan and James Chambers supposedly dueled because they were drinking and playing cards one night, and they argued over who had better mastery over ancient languages, and that led to a fight, and they ended up dueling. And Rowan killed Chambers, and then had a ring made that had a lock of Chambers' hair in it, as sort of a grisly memento.
Oh.
The ring, it's now in the Kentucky Historical Society collection. If you just sort of you can Google up Kentucky dueling ring, or Chambers duel, and it'll probably come
Oh
up.
gosh.
You can see like a great picture of it. So it's kind kind of a creepy memento from that duel. But two doctors in Lexington ended up dueling. They'd had long story short, there'd been an argument over a post-mortem examination, and one doctor insulted the other, and they fought. And one doctor shot the other one, basically severed an artery, and then stepped in to save the guy's life. So it's crazy.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's just hard to wrap our brains around.
Yeah, that is. Oh man, like I don't know, and I guess I guess if it came down to your honor and pride during that time, that was that's that was value above anything.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
Like your
you know,
reputation was everything at the time.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
again, this is among sort of white upper class males that
Hmm.
we're talking about who dueled, because I think I mentioned this. I may have mentioned this during the Ohio Bell episode, but it was, you would only duel someone from your own class, and so typically if you were an upper class Kentuckian and someone from a lower class insulted you, you had to deal with the affront immediately, and
Yeah.
so you would end up horsewhipping the person or caning them or beating them, and then
Mhm.
you'd sort of defended your honor. But if it was someone of your own class, you were both supposed to be gentlemen, and that's when you would end up sending a challenge out. And one thing I talk about in the book is, how did that sort of violence among upper classes change after the Civil War? And essentially what happened was, men started carrying concealed weapons all the time, and instead of kind of sending a challenge note, if you were insulted, the dueling code had gone away, so you would immediately defend your honor. And so, like, upper class Kentuckians at multiple instances across the state would just pull pistols and start shooting when they ran into an antagonist or if they were insulted. And so, like, the 1870s, 1880s, and I mean, for decades after the Civil War, I mean, this crazy sort of upper class violence went on in very public
Mhm.
places, and men were typically not prosecuted too. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of claims of self defense were used constantly in Kentucky
Mhm.
courtrooms. And
Well,
so,
William Goebel in
yeah, yep,
Covington, he shot somebody on the street, and that was the exact same thing. He said self-defense, the other
yep.
person pulled first, and he shot him right there in the street.
Yeah, and again,
And
it didn't hurt his reputation. I think that was 1895, so like 5 years
yeah,
before he became governor, and voters still supported him, and
yeah,
was just sort of crazy. And he shot the guy in the head at point blank range, and
yeah.
it's just, again, gotta love. This is one thing that's fascinating about Kentucky history to me is,
It gets wild.
yeah, it gets a little wild. It's good,
And I mean, you would think, maybe from 1800 to, Civil War would be the wildest time, but
right?
it probably wasn't. I mean, from 1870 to what 1940, it's kind of
Oh yeah,
crazy. I
yeah.
mean,
It's. I've been doing a lot of
vigilante
research.
justice, all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Oh, it's all, yeah. And even I've been doing a little bit of research on a kind of murder story in the early 1920s. And even then, I mean, concealed weapons were everywhere. And the problem was you had prohibition. So there was
Mhm.
a lot of drinking was going on, a lot of sort of prohibition related crime. Everybody was carrying a pistol. So it wasn't, kind of Kentuckians at the time were sort of, pretty quick to draw the concealed guns and use them at the time. And there was a big push from governors and legislators and judges to end the carrying of concealed weapons in Kentucky, even though it was illegal at the time. They really wanted to
Mhm.
kind of, punishments weren't really strict at the time, and so that's sort of a constant drumbeat among politicians in Kentucky when violence was so terrible. They're like, we've got to get concealed weapons out of here, like pistol
Mhm.
toting, as it was called in the 1920s. So headlines would always sort of talk about, pistol toter, gets off scot free, that kind of
Mhm.
stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, that kind of violence went on, and I talk about that in the book too. And how did that violence kind of change?
Mhm. Mhm. So I mean, well, I mean, did they? Uh, how did it change?
Well, I think there's sort of a cultural shift after the Civil War, and I think these guys were like, it's almost like they'd seen so much violence in the country that the pretense of having this sort of formal duel when men have been trying to kill each other on battlefields across the country, that kind of went away. And then the next generation of Kentuckians, kind of rejected this sort of Victorian notion of formal, well, not Victorian notion, but this sort of notion of formality and kind of having that violence should be constrained by rules at all. It's
Mhm.
sort of like going against the previous generation. They're like, we don't need to follow these rules. And but I think really the Civil War kind of ended it. And there were formal duels in the 1860s. Probably a few until the 1870s too. But it was, more very uncommon by that point. But there, again, there were a handful in the 1860s, late 1860s. Once the war drew to a close. But I do think it was, kind of that idea that hey, we don't need to follow rules for violence anymore. We didn't during the Civil War, and we certainly don't need to now. I'm still going to defend my reputation, but this time I'm going to do it with either the knife I've got in my pocket or the pistol I've got under my coat. And that that was sort of a big sort of cultural shift in Kentucky, where the upper classes began this much more spontaneous violence. The way I sort of look at it is like violence became sort of unregulated in Kentucky among upper classes, because I think my wife sort of gave me that phrase, which I was happy about. Like, she said, "Oh, like it's been unregulated." I was like, perfect. I'm just steal that from you. But that's kind of what happened. I mean, it became unregulated, and meaning like not a legal regulation, obviously, but sort of the societal regulations around dueling just were thrown out the window.
Yeah. Well, and just it is like there was rules. I mean, there was legit rules of how to duel, and how to, in a sense, a proper way to shoot somebody.
Yeah, that's it was just great. And and again, this passion was meant to rule the day. So if you and I were dueling, if you challenged me, I'd say, okay, we're going to duel at the the Boyle Lincoln County line somewhere is where we're going to duel Jameson, and I've chosen pistols at 10 paces. So you set these rules. The seconds sort of negotiate, and they say, okay, we're going to do pistols, and the way it's going to work is both parties are going to show up. We don't say anything to each other. We don't greet each other. We literally line up 10 paces. The seconds mark it out. And then what would typically happen, like happened in the Casto-Metcalfe duel, is that you'd flip a coin, one of the seconds would win, and then they would sort of have what was called the call to fire. And so they're the ones who would say, they'd go ready, 1, 2, or it was like they'd go basically fire, 1, 2, 3, stop, or something like that. And you could shoot any time during that count. And so that way, you couldn't sit there and, aim for 30 seconds and then pick the guy off if he missed you. The idea was like, okay, you need to get this moving and get it over with to keep it fair. And so in some instances, people would sort of shoot quickly and miss. That happened to Henry Clay when he was in Congress. He actually fired first and missed. And then his antagonist, who's John Randolph of Virginia, ended up sort of just firing into the air. And Clay had actually hit Randolph's coat. And they sort of reconciled because Clay was so impressed by Randolph, sort of shooting in the air and not shooting him. And it was something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Clay goes up to him and Randolph says, well, it appears that you've, or something like, it appears you owe me a coat, Mr. Clay. And Clay said something like, well, I'm glad that my debt is not greater. So, again, I'm paraphrasing, but meaning I'm glad I didn't actually take your life. And again, 2 members of Congress, that's what's crazy. I know. And there's a great book too called Field of Blood, which is about violence in Congress. And Joan Freeman wrote that. Who's an incredible historian. Actually, she has a book on dueling that's awesome. It's kind of a general history. And but the Field of Blood book talks a lot about. It's called the Graves-Silly duel, Cilley. And Graves was a Kentucky congressman, I think, and then Silly was from Vermont, was a politician. And Graves ended up killing Silly, and they fought with rifles too. And it was a huge national scandal, and really sort of turned Congress against dueling at that time. But that came out maybe within the last, 3 to 5 years, something like that. That's a good one too.
So with you always think of duels, and I mean it's the Hamilton Burr duel that probably everybody thinks of. 10 paces, you turn around and you shoot. But like the rifles at 60 yards and something, like, and you only have a few seconds. It seems like that would be that's even more mind-boggling, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of pressure in this. I mean, for any gun, but it's the idea was they would both for the Casto-Metcalfe duel that I write about, they would hold the rifle at present arms, and then as soon as the second called sort of ready, then they would aim, and then they'd have that sort of 4 to 5 second interval to shoot. Yeah. And again, they fought in Dover, Kentucky, which is in Bracken County, just next to Maysville. They fought at a place called the Fishing Shore that was right on the Ohio River. And a lot of times, duels were illegal. You wanted to keep them quiet, but word had spread. And there were actually about 200 witnesses.
Oh, wow.
Who saw this duel, crowding the banks of the river. And the atmosphere was initially sort of almost like a party scene, like both
Mhm.
sides were kind of, uh, not joyful, but not didn't appear too serious about it. But then at the end, when one of the men got killed, it sort of completely changed the tenor of the day for people, and
Yeah,
made things a lot more serious. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean,
understandably.
again, the dueling culture is just sort of fascinating, and the fact that these guys were fighting during the Civil War over an insult is pretty wild.
Yeah, which I guess that would be the old saying, well, not I don't think it's a saying at all, really, but when people talk about, you don't want to watch a car wreck, but you can't turn away in
Right.
life, that's
Yeah.
do you really want to go watch these guys fire
Right.
at each other and one of them possibly die? But I,
Yeah, I
you
think it was just
can't
such a
not.
spectacle. It was
Yeah.
really a spectacle,
Hmm.
and it's again, there are a lot of duels that no one's ever really heard of. There would just be sort of a brief mention in a newspaper article, for example. Um,
Well,
yeah,
I was gonna say so, like, because you talk about the white, the upper class
right.
people dueling, like it's hard to say this, but how low upper class like would have if a mayor? I mean, are we just talking about like the political elite,
Yeah.
or
Well, I mean, it was business
business elite?
owners.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really varied, and even some people had sort of um, kind of a pretense toward being elite with duel,
Hmm.
and so it was sort of. But the whole idea of honor was you couldn't claim status by dueling, and that was another
Hmm.
weird sort of component of dueling. Like, so you couldn't sort of proclaim your bravery by just fighting a duel, because that was
Hmm.
seen as sort of being low class even. So you couldn't like win your way into society by dueling once you were sort of scorned. And so like a lot of times, they wouldn't duel because it's like you are not a gentleman. You've shown me you're low class, so I'm actually not going to duel you because you're no longer the same social class. So if people didn't follow the right sort of steps of the duel culture, their challenge to duel could be rebuffed by the challenged party, and then you're left sort of dishonored in a weird way.
Yeah.
So honor is like a really just sort of strange, complicated thing, and as was the negotiations of duels, and sometimes they stretched on and on. I think when Andrew Jackson dueled a guy named Dickinson, that was fought down in Franklin County, Kentucky, or not in Franklin, Kentucky, on the Tennessee border. I think the negotiations for that stretched on for about 6 months. It was almost like Jackson and his counterpart really didn't want to duel, but the seconds just sort of kept the flame of the controversy still
Hmm.
alive. And that was I think he ended up Jackson got wounded, but he ended up killing Dickinson in that duel. So again, then he became president later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why
Well,
not? Makes perfect sense.
yeah. Yeah.
But
Oh well, and so again, so like, did they have a moment at before to like say, "Hey, let's call this off," or
they
was it
would, yeah. The
once they
seconds
got
was
to there?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So there were multiple opportunities where you could end it, and at the dueling ground, the seconds would sort of come together and go like, look, you know, Stuart didn't mean to insult Jameson. Like, can we work out some sort of agreement? And then, in this instance, they just said no. It's like
Yeah.
we're still going to have this fight. We're still going to duel. And sometimes they get called off because, like, once you get there and they're putting the pistol in your hand, it changes things completely. And so the puffing your chest out is no longer a thing when you're going to be shot at from
Yeah.
30 feet away. And so a lot of times that would end up ending the duel. But again, sometimes the animosity was so great that they would still end up fighting. And there are a lot of guys who became generals during the Civil War who ended up having fights before the Civil War, for example. And
Mhm.
so during the Civil War there were some duels too, like in addition to this one. So um, Brigadier General George Maney, I wrote a book on Maney's brigade at Perryville. Maney ended up fighting a duel after the Battle of Perryville against a doctor from Nashville because the doctor claimed that Maney had exhibited cowardice during the Battle of Perryville, for example. And so, again, Maney was defending not only his reputation, but also he saw it as defending his brigade's honor. And I think he ended up shooting the doctor. It's something. It's kind of there's not a lot of info on that particular duel, so I'm hoping to track that down at some point. But yeah, I mean, if you do like a historic newspaper search and just put in duel,
You're gonna get
between
a lot.
1800 and 1860, I mean, you still have a lot of hits. And a lot of different professions would duel more than others. I mean, soldiers, of course, dueled a lot, but newspaper editors, found themselves on the dueling ground quite a bit, and even editors ended up killing each other on occasion. There was a duel in 1846, for example, between two Richmond, Virginia newspaper editors at the time. One may have been a former editor, but they dueled with pistols and knives in 1846, and one killed the other. And in 1844, there's a duel between the editors of two Vicksburg papers, and one of those men ended up getting mortally wounded too. So, it's kind of what you wrote on paper, could end up leading you to the dueling ground. So some of these editorials, like George Prentice, who is the famous editor of the Louisville Journal, which was a really influential newspaper, he had tons of street fights, and he would sort of claim to support or hate dueling at various times whenever it suited him. But he got involved. I talk about in the book a lot of street fights he had, because there's a guy named Reuben Durrett who was a newspaper editor, kind of a rival newspaper editor in Louisville, and he was arrested during the Secession crisis too. And Durrett and Prentice had a shootout in downtown Louisville at one point. And I think Prentice had been shot in the leg or something like that. I mean, or no, a bystander had gotten shot in the leg. And again, like after that sort of after that gunfight that he had, Durrett had sort of come out of a door and swung his arm around the door and taken a pot shot at Prentice. And so after the fight, Durrett had challenged Prentice to a duel. And this was an instance where Prentice said, "No, you're a coward. You tried to shoot me from the door. You're not a gentleman. I'm not going to duel you." Durrett kept sending him angry letters. And Durrett became the founder of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville.
Oh, so wow!
Yeah, sort of a spiritual father of the Filson, and just a really interesting guy in his own right. But he got locked up in a northern prison during the war for several months too. So.
Well, and now Prentice though, was he more, because he was the whole Sue Monday guy.
Yeah.
So, but was he pro? He was pro South, right?
He was pro Union. And,
pro Union. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and he's the guy who sort of kind of got Union authorities ginned up about quote unquote Sue Monday, this girl guerrilla, and but two of his sons ended up fighting for the Confederacy. And,
that's what it was. That's right.
Yeah, one of them actually got killed, and I think at Augusta, the Battle of Augusta in September of 1862. And he wrote this sort of sad eulogy about, I think it was Cortland Prentice was his name, just kind of wrote this, in the paper, talked about how sad, this sort of the pain of a father. But yeah, I mean, he was, I mean, a while there, somebody needs to write a book on him, honestly.
Yeah.
I've got a friend and colleague who I always pester about writing a Prentice book, and I'm hoping he'll do it at one point. But it's a lot to tackle though with him, because he had such a sort of a crazy life.
Yeah, and wasn't he like? I mean, he was 1850-ish too, right? He Bloody Monday, all that.
Oh
stuff,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And he, a lot of people claim that he had sort of riled everybody up, sort of against Catholics and the Germans and Irish immigrants, sort of helped spark Bloody Monday. Jim Pritchard, who's a great historian and a friend of mine, sort of gives Prentice a break and doesn't think he was sort of responsible for it. Yeah. And,
yeah, but, I mean, and that's one, like, you don't hear as much about him unless you've dug around a bunch. But like,
right.
Sue Monday, like, those are things I've kind of looked into a lot. And like, he's kind of, he was kind of out there. Like, he was involved in a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah, tons. And he had a good sense of humor. A colleague of mine, Daniel Burge, has written an article on Prentice's humor that's pretty interesting too. And so, like, he was very good at insulting people, and which got him in a lot of trouble. That's one thing that, like, all these duel challenges. At one point, like, oh gosh, what story? Somebody got really angry at him for something he'd written, and he said, "Well, tell Mr. So and so I'll be at his house, with my pistols on in an hour," or something like that. And of course, the guy wasn't there, and but because he was not, again, he was happy to defend his own honor and his own reputation through violence, and that's kind of a running theme through antebellum Kentucky, and then again, as you mentioned, into the 20th century later.
Yeah. I'll just tell you, man, as far as the duel comes, like, as soon as we got there and they handed me the gun, I bet, you know what, he called me a scoundrel. That's okay.
Yeah, that's right. And well, the funny thing is too, there's if you wouldn't duel, so if you challenged me to a duel and I refused for some reason, you could then, it was called posting. You'd post me as a coward. And a lot of times it would be a literal sign somewhere, or it could be a notice you would put in a newspaper. And there's one
Yeah.
I end up sort of talking about in this book about a guy who got posted. I think he's from Bardstown, and it's like, he is a scoundrel and and sort of has this like terrible line about him, which is pretty funny.
Which that term sounds. I mean, sounds great. I'm gonna post you.
Yeah, and again, I'm gonna post you as a coward, and which is just absolutely. And here it is. So like, yeah. So in October 18, this is from the book. In October 1819, Burr Harrison published a broadside that announced, quote, "I publicly proclaim Martin Hardin Wycliffe a gasconading, cowardly poltroon and lying scoundrel, unworthy of the notice or credit of any but persons as base and contemptible as himself." So
Oh
again, a
gosh.
gascading, cowardly poltroon. So like, if you're calling somebody that, you meant business. But
Yeah.
that was probably, that was in 1819, and I think Wycliffe had succeeded Harrison in the state senate, so it's probably like they'd had kind of a political argument, and then
Mm-hmm.
one wanted to duel and the other didn't. So then he posted him as a gasconading, cowardly poltroon.
Gosh, insults are those are low blows.
Yeah, I know. I think I'm gonna change my Twitter handle to gasconading, cowardly poltroon. Be my, but
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Which I mean, and I mean it like thinking about it and like listening to it and reading some of the stuff, you think, man, this is just so like childish to a point, and
right,
you're like, but then you're like, oh wait, yeah, I've scrolled through Facebook the past before. It's not too much difference, but
right, right,
having them posting it
right.
is very very interesting,
Yeah,
to say
posted
the
it.
least.
And again, the guy had broadsides printed up and, would have put them around town basically. And again, you see that and you're not defending yourself. I mean, your reputation was in tatters. So that
Hmm.
can affect your
Hmm.
business dealings, I mentioned, and just a lot of different things about your
Yeah.
life. And, your social life would dry up, which was so
Hmm.
important during that period that, would lead to business deals and other things that, you certainly would not want to be posted. But
Yeah.
again, the complexities of honor were pretty crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Got to keep that honor intact.
That's right.
And that reputation, like the reputation, I understand, but like honor and reputation, I guess, do go hand in hand. And when
Right.
you're thinking back then, it was a bit of a different societal influence. Like your reputation
Yeah.
and your honor matter today,
Right.
but it's just presented in a different way, I
Yeah.
guess. You
And
know.
the big thing, and a lot of sort of honor historians, like there's a guy named Bertram Wyatt Brown. He wrote kind of a great book on honor. It's literally called Southern Honor. But he talks about that the whole point was, there's this need to avoid shame. And so, above all else, you wanted to sort of avoid shame, of shaming your family, of shaming yourself. And that need to avoid shame is one thing that kind of drove a lot of people to the dueling ground. Because
Mhm.
again, someone calls you a coward, you're ashamed, so therefore you're going to defend that reputation at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah. That that makes a little more sense, I guess. You
Yeah,
don't you don't want to be shamed, and it goes
right.
back to just like even when you're young and stuff, and people may thinking about the playground and all that kind of stuff. If somebody makes fun of you, it brings on that shame, and you want to defend it. And
Right.
at the playground, you might throw some fists or whatever. But it's just interesting how complex it was,
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
uh,
And again, you have all these politicians who end up dueling that are kind of showing public support for it. So,
yeah,
it's not surprising that kind of there were pretty terrible rates of violence during the antebellum period, because you've got the upper classes sort of would see themselves as modeling this behavior, and it was violence sort of cascaded down throughout society in a lot of ways.
yeah,
And again, people were sort of kind of short-tempered and hair-triggered. There's a great line about a Mississippian, and they said that he would pull a pistol if a cat tread on his toe, was sort of the line.
yeah.
And I think that kind of suits a lot of those duelists from that period.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, where can people get the book at?
Yeah, it's available in bookstores, and then also wherever you buy your books online. If you go to the University Press of Kentucky site, they've got links to, Amazon and Barnes and Noble, or you can buy it from them as well. And it's available in hardback and paperback, which is great. The paperback version's out, and I think the Kindle version comes out sometimes in early November. So they're releasing that within the next week or so, I think, if you read stuff on the Kindle.
Awesome. And then the audiobook with Morgan Freeman will come out.
Yeah, I wish. But if only. But no audiobook planned, unfortunately. But it's I need a movie version of it instead. If somebody wants to buy the film rights, and maybe I'll have to write my own screenplay, probably. But
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, as far as writing goes, when is the next book coming out, or what do you got on the roll?
I mentioned, I'm working on this sort of 1920s murder case that I'm sort of too early into it to talk, but I've always got different. Embarrassingly, I've got about 10 to 12 different book projects in various stages, which is awful. So I kind of, I get interested in one and work on it, then I find another crazy story and kind of, pull that one. But when I was writing this book, I actually sort of needed to take a break, and that's when I wrote the Murder on the Ohio Bell book. And so I may end up, work on one project for a while, and then I'll do something else and hopefully finish it. And but I think that I'm currently focused on kind of, and again, more violence, but kind of Prohibition era violence in Kentucky in the early 1920s. But it also involves like a few tales of kind of local political corruption too. So it's kind of looking at a father and a son. The son committed a murder in the early 20s, and the father, who ended up helping him kind of escape prison time because of the murder, ended up having like his own kind of political scandals in the community where he lived in Kentucky later on. So in the infancy of that project, but I mean, that won't be out for probably a couple of years if I can stick to it. But
no promises, right?
Yeah, no promises on it. I'll probably, and again, there's like a couple of other steamboat related books I've been working on, and a few other Civil War things too. So we'll see what happens. Just I kind of work on whatever is inspiring me at the time, and right now it's crazy Kentucky in the 1920s. So.
And there's plenty of that.
Oh yeah, pretty wild time.
Yeah. Well, Stuart, thanks for coming on. Anything else before we go?
I just appreciate you having me on, and I'd love to see the success of the show. It's great, and I'm really thankful that you've had me on. It's been fun.
All right. Well, we'll do it again, and hopefully soon. And just keep turning out those books, man. We'll get it going.
Yeah, and don't be a gascinating, cowardly poltroon, and you'll be in good shape.
I will not use that to insult anybody.
That's right. Yeah, tell that to your students. If they're acting up, you'll confuse them, and they'll be well behaved the rest of the day.
There you go. Yeah. That's what they'll ponder on. What did he mean? Anyway, well, thanks again for coming on, and thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.